Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Joining me on this episode of Writers at Work is C.M. Kushins, author of Cooler Than Cool, The Life and Work of Elmore Leonard, a biography of the master of American crime writing. A journalist whose work appeared in the Daily Beast, among other publications. Chad's previous works include biographies of Warren Zevon and Led Zeppelin's John Bonham. He left the world of rock for Cooler Than Cool, the first in-depth biography of Elmore Leonard, who revealed his mastery of concision, forward motion, and memorable dialogue in his 45 screenplay-friendly novels and countless short stories. My friend Charles Ardai, editor at Hard Case Crime, called Leonard the most influential crime writer of the last half-century, and that seems right. Chad interviewed Elmore Leonard's family and friends and had access to his files and planned memoirs, and shares with us previously unpublished excerpts from Leonard's unfinished final novel. His deep dive into Leonard's formative stages, at least to my mind, cast Leonard in a new light. More than once, Chad revealed a bit of information about Leonard's background and motivations that made me think, of course, that makes perfect sense. Which means he encouraged me to see someone whose work I admired as if he were brand new to me. And what more can we ask for in a biography of a contemporary? I'm eager to discuss Cooler Than Cool with Chad, who joins us now. C.M. Kushins, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. I'm a huge fan of the show, and I love talking about Elmore Leonard, so I was really looking forward to this.
Great. You know, I don't know anyone who doesn't like Elmore Leonard. Do you?
Personally, no. I was very fortunate about that there was a lot of enthusiasm about the project while I was working on it and during the research for it. So I think Elmore's pretty much got his a huge demographic of fans. And, I started as a fan when I was only 11 years old. I'm always surprised at the generational appeal that he still seems to have.
And why do you think that is? I mean, generally, people who reach the iconic uh, status and also becomes something of a brand generally have some people who resist it. But I honestly don't know anybody who's ever said to me, I don't like Elmore Leonard's work.
I haven't heard that either, which is nice. I mean, people play their favorites when it comes to someone who's considered a genre writer. And I personally think Elmore transcended that, but I know he gets put on the crime and mystery shelf or the Western shelf. My own opinion is why his appeal has lasted is that, the vast majority of his books, or over 45 novels, they have aged for the most part, they have aged very, very well. His themes are universal. He worked very hard over a 60-year career to have a very diverse array of characters that were as realistic as possible, sounded right, in the mind's eye, would look accurate. And his protagonists would always be from different POVs, where I think readers from many different generations probably see a little bit of themselves in some of his characters. I know I did, and I found it amazing that he could get into the mind of so many different types of people in those books.
You say that you became aware of him at age 11.
Yeah.
What work was that?
When I was 11 years old, it's funny because getting to know the Leonard family, because they were absolutely incredible in helping with the book. I'm roughly the same age as some of Elmore's grandchildren. And it was really fun hearing, when every generation of Leonards would start to become aware that, their father or their grandfather was really this legendary author. And I don't feel bad admitting this, but the film of Get Shorty, Barry Sonnenfeld's adaptation, came out when I was that age, and I was excited to see it. I had older brothers, so I was allowed to see that film. But I was a bookworm, so Mom got me Elmore's original novel before the film came out. And he had a fan for life at a very, very young age.
Yeah, I saw his films, the films of his book as a kid many years before I read them.
Mm-hmm.
I saw 310 to Yuma and Valdez is Coming on TV.
Nice.
And I probably didn't even know that they were books. Did you hear that from people that they were far more knowledgeable about his films than his
Oh
books?
yeah, I honestly think, and this was one of the fun lessons being learned. He's been my hero since I'm a kid. But the major lesson that was learned, one of them is that Elmore always had two jobs. And I have to emphasize, I can't stress that enough. He was always a working writer of fiction. He always wanted to produce and evolve and get better as a writer. But he always staked it with something that he deemed a little bit more stable. Everybody thinks he jumped from the advertising world right into fiction. No, they were concurrent for about a decade and a half, and he would still do freelance work and things like that while also writing the Western stuff. And later on, when he knew he could get his footing as a screenwriter, primarily in the 70s, he was spending the bulk of his time screenwriting and trying to make more work for the straightforward fiction prose that he deemed more important. I honestly think that he made his mark in Hollywood because being a screenwriter and his own love of films really had a huge effect on the sound and the voice that we recognize when we read Elmore. And I honestly think that he would joke that he was commercially minded, not with compromising the integrity of the work, but his stuff that even at their best, when his writing is really really mature, you still get a sense that there's a cinematic appeal to it. So I think that unless you really go out of your way, they should be adaptable. And some of the movies became classics in tandem with the books, especially the westerns. Those really hit in his early years before he was a superstar. And from the older fans, his kids' age, my parents' age, they grew up with the westerns. They all know Mr. Majestic. They also, I mean, which is technically a western, but 310 to Yuma, the Tall T, those are the ones that seem to excite a lot of the earlier generation of readers when I was writing this. And it made sense to me because I grew up in the 90s when it was his big resurgence.
Yeah, you mentioned his advertising career, and he did for many years have a day job as an advertising copywriting writer. Can you tell us, as you do in the book, what a day in the life of Elmore Leonard was like back then?
This is what fascinated me. No, I'm glad you asked that because I think that he really did have a very structured routine, which spilled over into how he had it, even in a creative life later on when he was successful and can work from home. He had a system that just worked for him, and I think that structure was important. He was a very devout Catholic in the 1950s, a complete Catholic education, and had great respect for the Jesuit brothers from his college years. And I say that because he didn't talk about it all that much publicly, but during the earliest years, before he would even go to work at the firm where he was as a copywriter, he worked for Campbell Ewald, one of the big, big, big ones. He actually would go to mass every morning. He'd go to the first mass of the day, I believe at Blessed Sacrament, which was nearest to the family home. And I'm a former altar server, so I know that's about a half-hour mass. So I'm imagining he would have gotten early, did his 2 hours of writing, did the half-hour mass, and then punched in at work by 9 o'clock. That's all one creative process. That it was the writing first, take care of the kids, church, and then work. And I think that structure stayed with him for a very long time. But it was a pretty brutal routine to get up at 5 o'clock every day and write for 2 hours at the kitchen table to make sure that you got your fiction out of the way before going to the office. And he did that for about a decade or so, and it paid off.
You at one point create this really delicious picture of him having um, a paper in his desk and his hand in his desk making
Mm,
notes while
yeah,
in the
thank you for
office.
that. That's it happened. Those are the beautiful details that came from getting to sit with his children. Who I was very blessed by this. We did big roundtable discussions at his son Peter Leonard. He was a wonderful novelist too, but I got to meet the bulk of the family at his home over a few days of marathon interviews, and they all would remember different things. Jane is the oldest, and then there was Peter, and they remembered when their dad was still struggling, when they were kids, and this and that. And you go all the way down to the younger children, like Katie and Bill, and Elmore was already famous, and now they remember Valdez is coming is in production and things like that. So all those little details about how his work schedule would change and how he struggled when it was the office life. And then he went into business for himself doing freelance work. And that was very, very frustrating for him. But that led to industrial filmmaking, to screenwriting. And then all of a sudden he knew how to write a screenplay, and now he was back through the eyes of, like, five different children who watched over the course of about 12 years their dad become famous. You would get some of the really cool little details
I bet.
of that inner life.
Yeah. So cooler than cool. What led you to this project, other than a desire to do it? I mean, how did it come together?
I was very blessed. Elmore was my hero since that age that I had mentioned before. But I did put it in the book because I think it does demonstrate what a good person he actually also was, which was a wonderful discovery. They say don't meet your heroes, but this is one of the ones where it worked out really well. When I was 15, I had finally written to him after years of being too nervous to do it. I sent a short story to a magazine and it got rejected. It was terrible, but I sent it to him for help, and he did. He
Oh,
proofread it. It was amazing. Yeah, no, he wrote back with a beautiful letter of encouragement, and he had proofread it and gifted me a short story of his right off of the printer. And I met him at a book signing not long after, and I know how corny this sounds, but I really idolized that this was someone who I knew was probably one of the biggest rock stars of their particular orbit, and was still such a down to earth, good person to take the time for me. Even at that age, I knew how many children and grandchildren he had. And he was just such a wonderful person that even though I got into nonfiction, I was able to get my first internship at a newspaper thanks to his letters, which impressed my English teacher. It was a trajectory that started when Elmore wrote to me to make sure to write every day and to take it seriously, that advice. So by the time his centennial was approaching, there weren't any other books that were in the works at the time. So I was able to contact the Leonard family, and Peter Leonard was generous enough to give me a blurb from my previous book, my biography of John Bonham. And the family did like my writing style. To paraphrase it, they liked that it was what I had in mind was a very loving portrait that was also objective to the work, and they worked with me on it. So it was in time for his centennial. Elmore would have been 100 years old this October, and my goal was to make sure to get that done for his birthday.
hmm. So what came first, the Zevon, Warren Zevon, or John Bonham? What
Hmm.
which
The Warren's book, Nothing's Bad Luck, was the first one.
that was first?
That was the first one because I am a piano player just for fun, and I love Warren's music. So he's one of my faves. But there wasn't as a musician, I was frustrated because there was only one book about him, but it had very little about his creative process, the studio stuff, and what I had initially planned as like a freelance feature story of Warren's studio habits became a book because so many engineers and musicians that had worked with him loved working with him and were enthusiastic about talking with me. I didn't plan on being a biographer, but all of a sudden, getting to talk with people who knew your heroes became a really, really, really fun way to use the journalism that I had done.
Yeah. For those who may not know it, Warren was a huge fan of crime fiction.
Oh yeah.
I recall that he was a loyal customer of the beloved Mysterious Bookstore in Los Angeles, um, which
Yeah.
is where I met him. I actually met him in the guise of being a mystery writer, not a music critic, which was the funny thing. I can guess the answer, but
Yeah.
I guess he was an Elmore Leonard fan. Yes.
As a matter of fact, before the idea of doing a book on Elmore was even a thought, when I was starting to interview Warren's friends and his exes and had fun talking with all the people who knew him, Elmore would come up in conversation. And believe it or not, I was told that at the time of his passing, Warren was actually rereading Rum Punch.
Ah,
So he was a big fan, as a matter of fact.
yeah. No, I don't see it as a giant leap from Warren to Elmore.
If you listen to a song, especially a few of the songs on, say, Mutineer, where Carl Hyacin was a co-writer and they were buddies at the time. Some of those songs sound like they could be the dust jacket. The lyrics could be the dust jackets for one of Elmore's books. That's the album I would recommend. That's why if you didn't know Mutineer, that's got some Elmore, Florida sounding stuff in there.
Great. So back to Cooler Than Cool. You show us that Elmore Leonard was raised in a loving home with
Yeah.
encouraging parents, and he loved to read as a child. Um, the sort of cliched view of the tortured crime writer of that era, the David Goodis type,
Exactly.
is the opposite of that. But
Yeah.
you show us Elmore is loved in a bookish household.
It is funny where people would make the assumption. One of the things that Elmore loved to do, if you go online and you watch some of his speeches or some of his appearances that were filmed, he always got a kick out of the fan letters he would receive from people that assumed he had been in prison or he was an ex-con. And he had a lot of fans who were law enforcement or in jail. He really had the wide spectrum of fans there. But he came from a very stable household, actually. Once they settled in Detroit, the family settled in Detroit for good when he was about 9. Elmore's father, Elmore Sr., worked for GM, so it was a bit of a transient lifestyle as a manager moving around the country. But they settled in Detroit, and it was, by all accounts, a very normal, loving household. His mother was, from everything that I was told, somewhat traditional, but was a huge book lover herself. And Elmore's older sister would always read to him. There was a subscription to the Book of the Month Club. So it was a very literate household, even though his dad was on the road a lot. And Elmore seemed to love movies and really had a way of loving storytelling, even as a child, that was probably dialogue based. But what amazed me is that he didn't even really start taking writing seriously, even as a hobby. He didn't have the major aspirations to that until he's in the Philippines in World War II when he was
I thought that
in
was
the
an
Pacific Theater.
interesting
Yeah.
part of the book. You as he wasn't a passive reader,
No.
and you show us how he learned to write by studying Hemingway.
Mhm.
So now, when he's in the Navy, it seems he started to read more widely. He started to read
Yeah.
different types of writing, and that led to the resuscitation of his interest in writing himself.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's the thing I never knew, because he preserved and kept everything, and he had all these letters from World War II, which it's at the beautiful literary archive at the University of South Carolina. But what's amazing is that Elmore was, like you just said, that was a perfect assessment. He was not a passive reader. He didn't aspire to be a writer at an early age. And he toyed with it as a kid. He wrote, a play when he was in 5th grade and stuff, but didn't think that he would have a stable career at it. But he was a very active reader, like you just said. That's a perfect term. And I think he got that from the Jesuit education, where anything he would read, even the fun stuff, there would be a very intuitive, deconstructive mind where this works, this doesn't work. Even though he wasn't planning on necessarily using it as a skill, he just kept thinking that way. I guess after reading enough, you'll be like, oh, I guess I could try this. I think I've learned a lot just from reading a lot. And the thing with being in the service during the war is, think about how many books became available to those servicemen, because you had books that were put into paperback editions just for people that were overseas. And if you look at the list of writers that came out of World War II, I'm convinced a lot of it was that they were far from home, and there were two things you could do: write letters or read a lot of the material that was being supplied. And it was bestsellers, it was the classics. Elmore got his hands on all of that, sometimes out of boredom, and he was active about it, like you had mentioned.
Yeah. As you point out, in his first published story, which was in the student-run publication, the University of Detroit, yes?
Mm-hmm.
You point out
Correct.
that, I'm going to quote you here, he tapped into a number of themes and narrative devices that would permeate his work for years. It's one of those amazing things, isn't it? We write and we seem to have a penchant for a certain style without fully knowing why.
Yeah, I'm very flattered that you picked up on that line. I thought a very similar thing when I looked at his earliest writing. It's snarky, but it's well written. I mean, it's a younger version of Elmore, so it's not as mature or mellowed yet. He was still a kid, but he is taking little jabs and at society. And I did mention that he did actually side with the valet, the chauffeur, as
Right.
opposed to the other protagonist. That's a theme that he carries over all the way to Stick decades later. So I think that his perspective was always there, and I think that his interest, what amused him personally, didn't necessarily change. He just got more mature and more articulate in how to get those themes across. But he had a perspective from very early ages, which I think is why even the westerns really hold up as well as they do. And he was only in his mid to late 20s at the time, so out of the gate, he knew how to tell a story, and those themes are still present there. It's true.
Yeah. So yeah, as you point out, he was married and he was on his way to having that large family. Um, is it fair to say that he wrote in part because he needed to earn a living beyond his salary?
This is what's funny. I don't know if that's necessarily a misconception or not. The thing that's interesting is I think the pressure that he might have been under, and this was told to me by the family, is that he was making a very good living in advertising. That's the thing that I think probably astounded his social circle at the time. It's, why do you aspire to write pulp westerns when you're really on your way to an executive position? People would covet the success you're having in the business world. He was doing very well, but he really loved writing. And he admitted later that the pulps were a way to just get paid while teaching himself to get better.
Hmm.
So I think the supplemental income was a way to legitimize it, but I think at the same time, he was going to be writing one way or the other. And it was either have very little progress by just trying to get into the slicks and they're more judgmental, or getting paid by the word, in a pulp magazine where at least he would be marking his own progress. And at some point, he might be able to get out of the business world. I don't know if he needed the money. I think he really knew how to utilize that genre to
Okay.
just become a better writer. But that is just my opinion. I think because he was very big in advertising for a while. As he always said, it treated him well.
And as you point out, he was actually featured in an ad in the New Yorker,
Yeah,
not
two of them.
not not as a writer, but as an advertising executive.
Yeah, it's amazing. Campbell Ewald took out two ads, 2 different years, and the first one says most likely to succeed, and it's a group shot of all the young copywriters and advertisers, and he's right in the bottom row, and he's a kid in the photo, and then years later, Campbell Ewald actually got a huge kick out of the fact that one of their copywriters had this, secondary life as a tough guy writer of westerns. They used him in an ad, and then they changed his assignment. They gave him trucks. They said, if you can write tough guy prose, go deal with the truck division. They thought it was cool. He could have kept writing that, except that the writing he could have kept, excuse me, riding that wave, but the writing, I think, prose actually started to really mature, and I think he was getting the idea. I can really get better at this, though.
What one of my favorite characters in the book is his agent Marguerite Harper,
It's great.
which
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about her a little bit. But she did advise him, don't give up your job to write.
Yep.
And I think what she meant was the writer's life isn't financially secure, and that a
Mm-hmm.
starving artist isn't good to anyone.
Yeah.
Is that how you saw that advice?
Absolutely. Also, because it was the same advice I got from my friend and agent William upon our first meeting too,
Yeah.
because and it's not it's very sound advice because reading trends change, and what sells now isn't a guarantee of longevity. And I think, first of all, I'm glad that you liked Marguerite Harper's story. She is such an unsung hero. People remember H.N. Swanson, his second agent, because that dude is a legend and a powerhouse. But she did get Elmore started for the first full decade of his career, and she really groomed him in the most positive way for what the writing life was going to be. And I think that her advice about keeping the day job was because she already was in her 60s when she scouted him. She was 40 years older than him. And all of her clients were men, and they were all writers of Western fiction. And she had seen the highs and lows of what he could have in store if he was gung ho about just staying in that genre. Um, just equally important. I love that the advice is to never do not give up your day job, because he didn't. He didn't give up a day job for over 20 years. He kept his word with that. But she also told him right at the beginning, start diversifying and get into more mainstream fiction. From the very beginning, everyone was trying to get him out of Westerns because they knew it wasn't going to last. And he kind of had to be pulled out of that. It took a while to convince Elmore to really abandon the Western because he had had so much success with it.
She seems to me to be, in some ways, the ideal agent in that um, she did everything for him. I can't imagine. I mean, somebody being so thorough that the way she chaperoned his short stories, even.
Mm-hmm.
She and you give us the sense that she was building his career for him. Uh,
I,
I,
I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry. Go ahead, please.
No, the assessment that you're giving makes me very happy because she is a genuine unsung hero that I knew very little about. And it was easy to write a picture about her that way because she was very open in her correspondence to Elmore. Um, I didn't mean to cut you off. I apologize.
No, no, not at
When
all.
when she was describing to him the daily regimen of what it takes to sell a writer, I don't think she was doing it for pity. I think she really wanted him to know that it was a team effort and it always would be. And it happens to be true even today. But he learned that early on. She paid for her own office. She did not have an assistant. She did all of her own typing. She stayed in touch with people all day. Her correspondence. This is not the era of emails. She had to type everything herself. She looked at the contracts herself. She would literally run out on her lunch hour to deliver manuscripts if she thought something was a hot property. And she did this for decades. For I think her biggest client, aside from Elmore, who he became, was Luke Short. Luke Short was a best-selling Western writer, and she sold all of his stuff for years and years and years. But if you look at all her correspondence, you could read her advice to young writers, and she pretty much wrote a book on what to expect when you're when you're trying to get published.
Yeah.
And I think Elmore had an incredible teacher, and I think he also listened to her because she was a maternal figure, and that comes across very strongly in their letters.
Yeah. One of the surprising revelations, at least for me, is that for someone whose prose is so breezy and seemingly effortless, Leonard did so much research for his stories. And I suppose he had to because he wasn't a cowboy or a sheriff or a resident of a small, dusty border town. But um, the way he was able to distill all that information and not let it make the stories cumbersome.
Oh yeah. Well, this is the thing it's important to remember. He had an incredible researcher, Greg Sutter, for over 30 years, starting in the late 70s. But prior to that, Elmore did all of his own research. And I think that that's because this is my own opinion. This is what I saw from his notes. His approach to it is a really great learning lesson to anybody that wants to get into writing. If you want to do it, take it very seriously, also as like your own one person business. And when his first few stories got sent back to him and it was lacking in detail, he gave himself a self education in indigenous peoples. He studied the Arizona territory, he read tons of books, and he kept a ledger for 10 years, a full ledger of the symbolism that was believed by different tribes, what they would call this. And he put a Bible together and he set a template for the type of research he would need moving forward. That makes sense to me because if you watch like a television show or a streaming series today, you know that the producer carries around what they call the Bible, just to make sure this episode doesn't contradict with this one. Elmore had his own for the world building of the Westerns, and he would continue to consult that and add to it. Um, so that's what he did for accuracy. But the impression I got, and this is funny, is that he avoided writing about the modern era at first because so many other writers knew how to describe the modern era, and today's readers know what the world looks like. But by researching a different historical period and being able to describe it in his own way, I think it overcame not writer's block, but he didn't have that. But I think it overcame the necessity of a new style, and I think that he stayed with that for as long as he could until he had to go contemporary.
Yeah. Yeah. When do you think the general public became aware of Elmore Leonard?
Well, it's funny you said before that you were aware of some of his movies, but you didn't realize it was that guy. I
Right.
think it's probably the same thing where it's like we could watch movies and not realize it's the same author, but it's like something about this I liked. I think people were aware of him in brief flickers during the '60s because of a few really great, the late '50s into the '60s, some really great films. But as the writer, as the author that he deserved to be recognized as, that kind of sort of came in the mid to late '70s after he had some real critical appraisals. And then in the early '80s, he had three books in a row that really just put him on top, which was La Brava, Stick, and excuse me, it was La Brava, Stick. I got it right here, but they came out consecutively, and they all came out at the same time, which kind of sort of put on the New York Times bestseller list, and people started to give reappraisals to the earlier work. Earlier stuff got put back into print, which was also crucial because he already had been a writer for 20 years. I would say '83 was probably the big year for him, '83 through '85.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the films, it seems to me that Get Shorty, everybody knew Get Shorty.
That
Would
was
you agree with that?
that was the big one, and I think it had a huge amount to do with. To be honest with you, it's also that it came out right after Pulp Fiction, and Travolta was really on top when that movie hit, and all the stars aligned.
I might have this. I may be wrong about this, but my memory is that Out of Sight. Um, I people saw Get Shorty and thought. Now I'm talking about the general public. I'm not talking about people who read him
Oh
religiously.
no, 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 no! This is good. Go ahead.
So Get Shorty comes out, and then people think, wait a second, I want to see more by this guy. And then
Yes.
they find Out of Sight, which I think Out of Sight is just a wonderful film.
Oh, I agree. There was this. No, I'm happy that you brought that up because Hollywood was such a huge mirror reflection of Elmore's career. Because that was his other day job. He stuck with screenwriting for a very long time. There were a few experiences in the '80s that did not go over very well with Elmore. He had had a very mixed experience with the film adaptation of Stick. The book is magnificent, but the film that was starring and directing Burt Reynolds, films, to be honest with you, was kind of a disaster. Elmore was very unhappy with the direction of it, and it flopped. And then he spent the better part of 2 years doing an adaptation of his amazing book La Brava for Dustin Hoffman, and it never happened. So after a few not so great film experiences, believe it or not, as his novels started to sell more and more and more, and he was making the bestseller lists, there was this erroneous belief that he was unfilmable.
Oh
And
God.
yeah, which makes no sense because there's such a cinematic appeal. It's just don't make any changes. Film it as written. It's not meant to be a comedy per se, and you got it. But that was tough to get across. And Barry Sonnenfeld really figured that out with Get Shorty. But he had to lobby for that as well. The film itself, when the book came out, it's a masterpiece. The book Get Shorty. But there were some people that were skeptical if a film critical of Hollywood would go over well in Hollywood. It had to be handled very delicately. And I think the idea that Barry Sonnenfeld and producer Danny DeVito got the humor, really, what humor was in there by playing it straight is why that one really, really worked. And when the early word of mouth came out for that, other properties of Elmore's just started to all of a sudden sell and sell and sell because it's like they cracked the code of how to get his sound on film.
Mm,
And Sonnenfeld was the first to really do that. Then you had some great films in the '90s right afterwards, but that was the first one.
yeah. So anyway, Justified comes along when he's 83, 84, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so, but its protagonist, the Marshall Raylan Givens, first appeared in a 93 novel, Pronto, and then 2 years
Awesome.
later, writing The Rap. Um, how did Justified come to be? Because I think I recall that Raylan was just part of the ensemble.
Yeah, it's funny. He was part of the ensemble in those two books that you had named, and they're stronger for it because the show Justified kind of morphed into an ensemble, and I think that that feeling gets across. But Elmore himself loved the character of Raylan, and from what I had been told and what I read in his notes, he was looking for a way to bring him back. He liked writing the character of Raylan, and to the early 2000s, he had a deal with a now defunct online magazine called Contentville. Didn't last very long, unfortunately, but his contract was an original story and then two previously unpublished works. And this October, one of them that he wrote in 1970, Picket Line, is coming out by HarperCollins. I've
Ah,
been lucky enough to read it. It's magnificent, and it's what eventually slowly evolved into Mr. Majestic, but it's a standalone thing. It's fantastic. The Picket Line's coming out, but it was originally supposed to be published as part of this agreement. Backtracking, the original thing that he wrote for Contentville was Fire in the Hole,
okay.
which became the pilot episode of Justified. It was almost like the contract called for Elmore to bring back a previously popular figure that was not tied up with rights. And he finally found an excuse to bring Raylan Givens back. And as soon as he wrote that, and as soon as it was published, it was scouted by Graham Yost, who saw it as a show immediately. So lightning struck immediately with that. As soon as that one was published, the producers of Justified saw that they would go on to be the producers. They saw it as a pilot episode immediately.
So what did you, as a writer, take away from the experience of doing Cooler Than Cool?
Oh, thanks. I guess on a personal level, I can say it's rare, but sometimes you pick the right hero. It was really wonderful getting to hear all the best stories about Elmore and that he was able to walk the line as a good person and a serious writer. Because you do hear the horror stories, and you had brought that up earlier. And one of his earliest heroes was Hemingway, but he made a conscious decision: I'm not going to live like this. And I was happy to see that I had the right hero at a young age. But pragmatically, I love that Elmore was. I think this is fair to say that he was probably, in my opinion, the most successful archetype for a successful American professional author. In that he never made any compromises to his style. He took the writing seriously and always wanted to get better, but he always worked within a commercial genre where he could entertain, he could sell, and he could always stake himself to keep learning and keep getting better. And I think that he used, doesn't it sound corny, but I think he got that from being a copywriter for the automobile industry. And I think it's also because he lived a very American life, that it's the way he approached being a pro author. And it sets a very good example to see how he conducted himself over the course of a long career.
So what's next for C.M. Kushins?
Oh, thanks for asking. Two things, but the first one is probably the most exciting for me personally because it's the one that's keeping me from sleeping properly at night. After three biographies and getting to really, really do a master class in Elmore, I am working on my first crime novel.
Ah, there you go.
Thank you. I hope to get to talk to you about that. Fingers are
Great,
crossed.
great. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work has been C.M. Kushins, author of Cooler Than Cool, The Life and Work of Elmore Leonard, a biography of the master of American crime fiction. Chad, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jim. This is a blast.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.